story in Piers Anthony's Incarnation of Immortality series with the Tangled Skein is a long book that covers a long period of time, several decades, which is probably one of the reasons why I liked this book as much as I did. We meet our main protagonist, Niobe, and I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Niobe, but we'll say that it's pronounced Niobe, when she is a young woman of 21, and we follow her throughout her life for the next several decades as she gets married, is widowed, and becomes an aspect of the Incarnation of Fate, and then, well, actually pretty much does the whole thing over again. But when you're telling a story about fate, then you almost have to cover a long period of time in order to show how fate plays out and how the different connections of the threads are made and so on. And that's really what we see here, a life played out so that we can actually see how fate is working in this character. Also, I think that Niobe is probably one of my favorite Anthony protagonists. She is given definite virtues and flaws at the beginning of the story, and we see her exhibit a great deal of growth throughout her life. Honestly, my only real issue with her is that Anthony does have an unfortunate tendency to focus on the appearance of his characters, particularly his female characters, and he spends a great deal of time talking about how beautiful Niobe is when she's a young woman, and then later how beautiful she's not really anymore when she's middle-aged. And it's really a shame to see such an interesting and deep character be trivialized by describing her appearance so often. But as far as the Incarnation of Fate goes, Anthony takes the fate from classical mythology, which has three aspects. Clotho, the young, who spins the threads of life. Lachesis, the middle-aged, who measures and sets the thread of life on the tapestry. And Atropos, the elder, who cuts the threads of life. And I'm sure I'm pronouncing all of those names wrong in some way. Feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm sure I don't need to give you permission. So in this story, fate is actually three separate women, a young woman, a middle-aged woman, and an old woman, inhabiting the same body and coming out whenever they need to perform their particular task. And Fate, we find, is actually an incredibly powerful incarnation. She has control over people's lives, who they're going to interact with, how long their lives are going to be, and the manner in which they will be born and eventually die. So it makes a certain amount of sense that this book would cover a very long period of time, would be the most plot-driven of any of the novels in the series, and would show us the various connections to the overarching storyline. This book starts a generation or two before the events of On a Pale Horse, and ends about a year after On a Pale Horse ends. So we get to see the inception of a number of events that we've already read about, as well as the introduction of several characters that we meet earlier or later in the series. Anthony will do this on occasion in his stories. He will write about an event that he already wrote about, but looking at a different perspective, and it doesn't always work terribly well, but it works pretty well in this story because of its subject matter. As a result, this book doesn't quite stand on its own as a separate story as well as some of the other books in the series, but as a functional part of the overarching storyline, it works very well. Despite this, though, the plot does meander here and there, as Piers Anthony's plots have a tendency to do. There are a couple of sequences where Niobe is going through what is essentially a series of puzzles, in the Hall of the Mountain King in the middle of the story, and in the Maze in Hell at the end of the story. And whenever Anthony writes sequences like this, he delights in showing off his own brilliance for puzzles by painstakingly walking us through each and every single one. And the puzzles are fairly clever, and I did appreciate how he approached the puzzles specifically in the Hell Maze, but we really didn't need as much detail as he gave us. And there was one chapter in particular that just completely bored me. Maybe not quite as much as some of the chapters in Bearing an Hourglass, but still quite a bit. And again, the chapter basically just exists for Piers Anthony to show off how much he knows about a particular subject, in this case, martial arts. And maybe if it factored into the story a little bit more, I would have found it more interesting, but come on, I didn't need to know the name of every single solitary move used in that sequence. But overall, even though it had a few flaws here and there, the book left me satisfied at the end, and I enjoyed it overall. If nothing else, it's a welcome respite after the travesty of the last novel. So, a few bumps here and there, but overall, a pretty good story, and I would give it a worth owning used. And next we move on to the Incarnation of War, and the fourth book in the Incarnations of Immortality series, Wielding a Red Sword. See you then.